Here we are for another round of the 70s versus the 90s, and it's a showdown between two horror icons when I put John Carpenter's Halloween against Wes Craven's Scream. And like this one, man, this one was a fun one to get through because both of these movies are great in their own right. So let's just dive right on in because this one's gonna get real nitpicky. So first up, we have John Carpenter's Halloween, which is clearly like one of the greatest horror films of all time. Like where Psycho like left off, like Halloween picks up and runs with it, And then, but it's a real simple story, this kid and that opening sequence in Halloween is one of the best of all time. And not to mention the music and the sounds that John Carpenter created for this. This is probably what makes this movie the most scary is the fact that it's just the music and the sounds and the way it's all presented, because there's a visual vocabulary that's on a level with Alfred Hitchcock that John Carpenter displays here, especially that opening sequence. And it's not to be, not to mention that the whole movie almost is told from the killer's perspective. Mind you, this is like a good 2 years before Friday the 13th would, subtly make it that the whole film is told from the killer's point of view. Here we can kind of tell, we see Michael Myers lurking through the shadows, but that opening where he's a kid and he kills his sister on Halloween, and then 15 years later, he's like doing shit again, and he escapes from a mental institution. His doctor is played by Dr. Sam Loomis, played brilliantly by Donald Pleasance. And now he's on the run. He's going back to his hometown of Haddonfield to like kill some more people on Halloween, the anniversary of when he killed his sister. And now he's a grown-ass man. He's driving, and which is like that in of itself. The beauty of Halloween is its simplicity. It's like we don't really dive into the psychology of Michael Myers until the sequels and stuff. And of course, this movie leaves it wide open for a sequel. Most of his victims center around a group of babysitters played by Jamie Lee Curtis and Nancy Loomis and the wonderful PJ Souls. And of course, this is Jamie Lee Curtis's first movie. She's kind of cast, in a bit of like a little bit of nepotism, I guess you could call it, because the main reason she got cast in Halloween is because they wanted Janet Leigh's daughter, who of course had that iconic shower sequence in Psycho. Here's Jamie Lee Curtis doesn't have any iconic shower sequences, but that end sequence, where she's being chased by Michael Myers, in the closet, she does a lot of dumb shit, but it kind of works out for her, because of course Loomis is, for somebody that knows this guy, he always seems to be, a few steps behind him and stuff, and it's a real fucking like tense, film. You're on the edge of your seat because you don't know who's going to get out alive. There's a lot of good jump scares. Like I said, the visual vocabulary in this film is incredible, on top of the music and a very well written script. John Carpenter co-wrote this with Deborah Hill. John Carpenter handles the horror shit and Deborah Hill handles the female aspect of it. That's why these characters seem a lot more real than most horror films. It's not really, they're not shitty people, they're just normal ass kids. And, kind of the brilliance of having your horror film take place on Halloween where like, you're running for your life, but how many times have people seen this like prank been pulled on Halloween? So pretty brilliant stuff, and even if it is pretty basic, Michael Myers is this indestructible killing machine, which I would argue is even more chilling than, having everything explained to you, because somebody that's just there killing, and I don't give a fuck what the mask comes from, William Shatner bleached out and shit. That doesn't matter. What's scary about it is this motherfucker just keeps coming and coming like the Energizer Bunny and, doesn't say shit. He's there in the shadows, man, and he's fucking shit up, But then we move forward to Scream, where it's like you have a script by Kevin Williamson, who's very like, very clearly watched every single horror film imaginable. Clearly a fan of horror films, but like a lot of horror film fans, they have to justify liking horror films by making fun of them. So he writes a very satirical script, but then he gets a director like Wes Craven to make the film. And, Wes Craven, on a level with John Carpenter as far as making horror films. Of course, both of them are responsible they each have one of the most iconic horror film icons of all time. Of course, John Carpenter with Michael Myers and Wes Craven with Freddy Krueger. both movies that get referenced a bunch in Halloween in Scream, and because there's so many parallels to Halloween with Scream that it's like their visual vocabulary is there, but it's not doing anything groundbreaking. Of course, the opening scene clearly an homage to Psycho, where you have like one of the hot stars of the '90s, Drew Barrymore, playing a character that gets killed like in the very beginning of the film. Pretty basic. But what's brilliant about Scream is the fact that it's also making fun of society while it's also making fun of horror films, which in a way, that's what horror films do. That's what horror films have done since the 30s, and even before that in the silent film era. The horror films are like they're moral tales. They, as Jamie Kennedy lays down all the rules. Jamie Kennedy, of course, playing that annoying film geek that you go to the video store to find some random ass movie that you don't know the title for, but then he's gonna talk your ear off about every single fucking horror film that he's ever watched and critiqued on and stuff. So the other thing too is that unlike Michael Myers, we know everything gets explained to us in the end of the film, in the big climax and stuff. Which by the time they get to that, it's so lame because then there's twists and there turns, and they're not even that good at twists and turns. Honestly, it's shit you probably could have seen coming a mile away. And the film itself likes to think it's a lot more clever than it is. But the fact that you have these two guys that just kill people because that's just the movies. They're obsessed with movies. Like the Skeet Ulrich character, who's also banging or trying to bang the Neve Campbell character, Sidney Prescott, who her mother was killed by who she thought was Cotton Leary, but then turns out it's actually her boyfriend and his friend that killed her mother. And because her mother was banging his father, and there's a lot of drama going on, all is revealed in the end of the film. And by the end of the film, you're just kind of like, it started out strong, it was interesting, but even then, it's like that whole "what's your favorite scary movie" type thing, and like all this stuff that's very self-aware of itself. It's like, oh, well, they did that in this horror film, and it's like, oh, here's the shit you do in this horror film. And while at the same time being dumb, honestly, what's beautiful of Halloween is it does take itself seriously. And it understands what it is, and it becomes frightening that way. Whereas Scream, it has a way of like being a comedy but playing it seriously, because some of the kills are pretty inventive. Like when they catch Rose McGowan in that fucking garage door, and but most of it's like just very contrived. Like, oh, there's a 30-second delay on the thing when he's watching Halloween when it goes and there's a parallel thing, and even like Skeet Ulrich being a fake ass Johnny Depp, it's his whole fucking emo kid, fucking sad sack mama's boy bullshit, because there are a lot of layers. Like then we get like deep into the psychological aspects of it. Dude ain't getting laid. He's got a weird obsession with his mother, and his friends just along for the ride. Peer pressure, as he calls it. It's just basic ass shit. I mean, even you had Fonzie as the principal, and there's a lot of like subtle tongue-in-cheek nods to better horror films, and specifically Halloween. That's why, honestly, Halloween wins this round. I mean, is there any doubt in our minds? I mean, I'm sure there's hipsters around that be like, nah, man, it's Scream, man, because it poked fun of horror movies. You know what? Scary Movie did it way better, did the same shit that Scream was supposed to do, and should have just played it as a comedy. But Wes Craven, makes it a more serious movie, even at times when you can really see the comedic aspects of it, and it just kind of ruins the film, especially when it tries to get too serious. The thing about Halloween is you have this indestructible killing machine in a very Hitchcockian vocabulary way of being shot, and even the ending, they leave it wide open for a sequel. But even in Scream, they kind of do, because they joke about that shit. Oh, there's always a sequel. You got to have a sequel, and especially anything that makes money is going to get a sequel and stuff. But I'm granted they didn't know that. They made the film. Who knew it was going to blow up as much as it did? But if we're talking what's the better movie, it's clearly Halloween. Now, maybe the better social commentary, I'd give it to Scream, but I'm not here to see what gives the better social commentary. I'm here to say which gives the better movie. And Halloween definitely delivers on a film, very well written, a lot of good like scares, and that music too just really like accentuates the chillingness of the film, and just the setups and everything, because like Scream's very basic when we're talking filmmaking and stuff, but and even the dialogue is lame as fuck. Like Kevin Williamson was a highly overrated writer. He was good at like making fun of shit, but not really good at making anything, that has something to say. So for anybody keeping score, that's 44-36. The 70s are up by 8. They're even kicking ass, especially with the horror films. When you got classics like Halloween, it's hard to measure up. Now, like I said, it was a really close one. I'm nitpicking, to the point where it's like, which one is the better movie? Who really fucking knows? But I'd probably say Halloween, and I fucking did. So 44-36, 70s up by 8. If I said anything wrong, anything you disagree with, feel free to eviscerate me in the comments. The next main event is Dirty Harry versus Seven. You'll see that next Saturday. You'll see more of these bonus rounds pop up and everything. But, the biggest takeaway is John Carpenter, one of the greatest, if not the greatest horror directors of all time. Wes Craven comes close, but he definitely didn't do it with Scream. He did it with other shit, and, they just he needed a retirement fund, and they needed a solid director to make a comedy or horror film. Whereas, like, Halloween, John Carpenter just made a real ass film that still sends chills down your spine to this day. And like I said, summer's over and this shit's only heating up.